Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Lewis, the Director of Collections and Research at the Pilsen Historical Society. I'm so glad that you joined us for today's presentation on the Kentucky African American Civil War Soldiers Project. Dan Gediman has had a long career as a radio journalist and documentary producer, whose work has been heard on All Things Considered, Morning Edition, Marketplace, and This American Life. For many years, he was the producer of the public radio series This I Believe, which inspired 9 books, the first of which was a New York Times bestseller. More recently, Dan has produced the Audible documentary series The Homefront: Life in America During World War II, which was narrated by Martin Sheen. Since 2019, he has been producing the Reckoning radio and podcast series, which has led to the Kentucky African American Civil War Soldiers Project, the subject of this presentation. I'll return to moderate questions after the presentation as time permits. Please join me in welcoming Dan Gediman.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for introducing me, and I want to thank the Filson for inviting me to do today's project, and indeed for supporting the research that I've been doing for the past several years for the Reckoning series and for this particular African American Civil War Soldiers Project. So thanks again to the Filson for all of that. And also Patrick himself is serving as an advisor to this project and has been of invaluable aid in the research that we've been doing. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing screen for my presentation. Wonders of modern technology. All right, so this project has grown out of the Reckoning public radio and podcast series that I've been producing for the last several years. Some of you have heard it. If you haven't heard it, I recommend going to our website, reckoningradio.org, and you'll find all of the 10 episodes of the series that we have produced so far, which will sort of help put all of this into context. So why this project is important. As I was researching the Reckoning series, it became very clear that enslavers in Kentucky and elsewhere had really dehumanized Black people and had treated them as property, had broken up their families through sales and inheritance. And part of that dehumanization project was that their names were rarely recorded in any kind of official documents. And when they were put in any kind of documents, only first names were used. To add sort of insult to injury, after slavery, many archives did not keep track of the enslaved data in documents that they possessed. This is really true across the board. And what became clear is that because of this absence of overt information about enslaved people, African Americans repeatedly have a very difficult time trying to research their family history. But as I was researching the series, it became clear that there was information out there about enslaved African Americans. It's just, it was well hidden. So when I interviewed a family of, a group of descendants of a family that was enslaved at Oxmoor here in Louisville, and shared with them information that I had found about their ancestors, this was all information that they had never heard before. One of the members of this family described this as life-changing information. And she explicitly said, when I asked a question about what reparations might look like for her, that she said the number one thing she wanted to know was who her people were. She wanted to know who her ancestors were, and that she had spent several years doing genealogical research and not being able to find anything about her enslaved ancestors. So it was her wish that there be a place that African Americans could find this information without charge. And so this project directly grew out of that request on her part. And the difficulty that we found even finding her and her relatives. So it's a truism of slavery that white enslavers did not keep track of enslaved people's names unless they had a good reason for doing so, usually something to do with money. So their names will show up in wills and estate settlements. They'll show up in lawsuits. They'll show up in bills of sale, usually first name only, but nonetheless, it's there. But one institution that did keep track of the first and last names of enslaved people was the US military during the Civil War, once enslaved men were allowed to enlist as soldiers. So that begins in 1863 in the northern states, and in 1864 in Kentucky. Just parenthetically, Kentucky was the very last state where the Lincoln government essentially allowed Black people to join the Union Army. So Black people don't start joining the Union Army in Kentucky until mid-1864. Now, one of the things that happened in the Union states that had slavery, including Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, Washington, D.C., portions of Tennessee and Virginia, West Virginia, is that they kept track of the names of enslavers so they could be compensated for the financial loss of having their enslaved men fight in the war. And the way we learned about this is through a set of ledger books that were kept by clerks affiliated with the War Department to keep track of the names of roughly 9,000 enslaved Kentuckians who were members of the US colored troops. So they enlisted to fight in the Civil War. And these records give us information that we otherwise would not be able to find in one place about enslaved Kentuckians. And that is their first and last names, birth year and location, and the names of their enslavers. These ledgers were, and still are, miscatalogued in the National Archives as being information about Missouri Black soldiers. And so I stumbled on these ledgers when I was researching one of the ancestors of these folks that I interviewed for the Reckoning series, a man named, who was known in slavery as James Sanders. And I figured out that he was probably the right age to be in the US Army. But when I went looking for Jim Sanders in the military records, I couldn't find him. And then I realized that I should check using the name of his enslaver, who was a former US Senator named Archibald Dixon. So I put in Jim Dixon. And all of a sudden I found his military records. And so it was through these ledgers that I realized, so when I looked him up as Jim Dixon, I found this ledger that had his name in it. And then I started to realize that there were hundreds of pages of these listings of Black soldiers from Kentucky. And it became clear that because of the information contained in these ledgers, we had something like a Rosetta Stone that would open up our ability to find other information about African Americans who had been enslaved. So our goal with this project is that with the information that can be found in these ledgers and the military records that are attached to them, we will research the lives of these soldiers and their family members, going as far backward in time and as far forward in time. And that in the process of doing this, we will help African American families to learn about their ancestors. We're going to place all of this data. In fact, we've already built this in a free searchable database that will be available to the general public, but specifically, our hope is that it will be an invaluable resource to African Americans in Kentucky and all over the country who descend from these soldiers. Genealogists at familysearch.org, which is one of the largest genealogical entities in the world, which is an offshoot of the Church of Latter-day Saints in Utah. They estimate that for every Civil War soldier, African-American Civil War soldier who had children, there could be up to 1,700 descendants for each one of those soldiers. So since we have about 9,000 soldiers, we think this has the potential to impact over 15 million people who are alive today who might descend from these soldiers. So here's what these ledgers look like. This is just a sample page from one of them. And the key piece of information in here is this one column which says name of owner if a slave, okay? And also to the right of that, there is a column that keeps track of, in many cases, the name of the attorney who is handling the claims case for the white enslaver that previously owned this soldier, and also dates where paperwork was generated by the US Army to prove that the soldier served in the Army for the benefit of his enslaver who wanted to get paid. By the way, they were entitled to $300 per soldier if they could prove that they, A, owned that soldier previously, B, that they were loyal supporters of the Union, and that indeed the soldier served in the Army. So they had to prove ownership, the soldier served in the Army, and that they were a loyal Union supporter. So once we have these ledgers, then we can go look for that soldier's military file. And these are available in several different places. They're on Family Search, they're on the National Archives website, on Ancestry as well, and Fold 3. So this happens to be the card for the gentleman that I was talking about, Jim Dixon, who was known as James Sanders, both before and after the war. So in the back of these military files, we can often find the actual compensation forms that were filled out by the enslavers to get their $300. Okay, so here's an example of one for a soldier from Louisville named Emmanuel Taylor. And this is paperwork that his enslaver put together. So one of the things I learned as I was doing this research is that the founder of the Filson, Reuben Durrett, made apparently a good sum of money as an attorney processing these compensation claims. So to the left, you will see an ad that he ran in, I think, every day's newspaper in both the Courier and the Journal, announcing that he had particular expertise in this kind of work, that he and his, I guess, associates at his law firm would be able to, for no cost, but for a commission, they would process the paperwork for you to get your $300 per soldier. On the right, you will find a form, a pre-printed form that his law office created that an enslaver could fill out and then submit to the US government for compensation. So, and I recently found in the Filson's files itself that Durrett has all of the files pertaining to his compensation claims that are apparently available in alphabetical order in the files at the Filson. I passed that along to Patrick Lewis, and he has said that this would be something perhaps that the Filson staff could look into. So just wanted to mention that. So these forms that the enslavers filled out to get their $300 often has really important information about who was the enslaver before that enslaver. Because remember, this is a period of time when the slave trade was extremely fluid and ongoing. People were regularly buying and selling slaves, especially in Kentucky, especially in the Louisville area, which was a hub for the slave trade, which is something we go into in quite a bit of detail in the Reckoning radio series. So here is the enslaver of this particular soldier who's explaining that he in turn had purchased these enslaved people from this guy, Thomas Hansbaugh, or Bro, who signs an affidavit saying that he sold these slaves on a particular date for a particular sum of money. Now, we've already talked about this, that the ledgers contain enslaver names. This happens to be how I found out about this particular Jim Dixon, and that his enslaver was Archibald Dixon, who was married to one of the daughters of the Bullitt family who ran Oxmoor Plantation. Now, once you have these enslaver names, you can go looking for other things. So this happens to be Archibald Dixon's slave schedule. So starting in 1850, the US government, I guess technically well, I don't know what part of the US government, I guess the Census Bureau, decided that they should not just keep track of all of the white people, but they should also keep track of all of the enslaved people, and that they should know more than just how many there were, but that they should know the name, or not the names, but the ages and the genders of them. So this fellow, Archibald Dixon, happened to be one of the largest slaveholders in all of Kentucky. And so you can see 2 pages of enslaved people that he owned. Now, we can also, once we know the name of the enslaver, go looking for wills, deeds, and estate settlements. So both of the things you're looking at here are documents that I found in the holdings of the Filson about a couple of enslavers that are talked about in the Reckoning radio series. So on the left, you see a typewritten facsimile of a will from Alexander Scott Bullitt. On the right, you will find an estate settlement, which is what would be done if somebody died without a will, that lists enslaved people by first name, age, and value. So this is something that can be found in the courts, the Jefferson County court records that are available at the Filson. Now, this was a huge find as we have been doing this research. And that is, for Catholic enslavers, there are baptismal and often marriage records for enslaved people, okay? So this is a typewritten index put together by a Catholic priest named John Lyons, who made it his life's work during the 20th century to transcribe handwritten baptismal and marriage records for churches all over the central Kentucky area. And also in the process, he often translated from Latin to English. And these are all available in the Filson collection. And we are in the process of getting all of them scanned, transcribed, and indexed in a spreadsheet to keep track of all these relationships. So, and because many Black Catholics have kept the name of their enslavers, in many cases, we can follow these families forward to the present day, still using the names of their, early 19th century enslavers. And by the way, although I haven't done this yet, theoretically, we could go back and go to Maryland church records, baptismal records, and find the grandparents of these people and the great-grandparents of these people. Because remember, enslaved people were being enslaved in Maryland by Catholic enslavers as far back as the mid-1600s. So this is potentially a game changer in terms of being able to follow these Black Catholic families, perhaps as far back as the 1600s and forward to the present. So this is a major sort of side project that we have embarked upon that has grown out of this Civil War project. And we went looking at these church records to see if we could find evidence that these soldiers had their baptismal records available in these church records. So hopefully a year from now, we'll be doing a presentation just about this particular church records project. Now, this is the key thing that I stumbled on that is really even more of a game changer for a lot of Black families. And that is, if soldiers survived the Civil War, or even if they died during the Civil War, their widows apply for pensions, okay? And later, if they lived through the war, they themselves apply for, they were called invalid pensions. And so this is an example of a pension card at the National Archives that importantly tells us the various names that this man was known by. So he served in the Army as James S. Dixon, but in freedom, he was known as James Sanders. And so by knowing these two names, we can go looking for these families in the 1870 and 1880 and 1900 censuses. And we can follow these families forward into the 20th century, find their children, find their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, et cetera. So, and just by the way, as part of our ongoing conversations with the Latter-day Saints folks at Family Search, they have identified nearly 100,000 soldiers who have pension cards under another name. And from just looking at a couple of hundred of those, it looks like the vast majority of them are African American. So there could be tens of thousands of soldiers who served under one name and were known by another name in freedom. So also these pension files have important health information because, first of all, when they enlist, there's often a physical done that takes a health history. So we know about their health history prior to entering into the service. And then later on in the pension files, we find out about health problems that they developed as older men, okay? So in the process of doing this, I learned about health problem that this particular soldier had, and as I was able to share it with his descendants, and it turns out this is evidence probably of a congenital illness that has passed down through this family to the present day. Also, we can find marriage records and death records that might otherwise be unavailable. So for this particular married couple, I could not find a marriage certificate anywhere else but in this pension file. And by the way, these pension files are not online, or let me put it this way, very, very few of them are online. So it's an expensive process. Before the pandemic, it would cost anywhere between like $40 and $60 or so to ask somebody at the National Archives to go find these files, make copies of them, and send them to you either as photocopies or scans. So one of the goals of this project, once the pandemic lifts and we're able to get into the National Archives, is that we're going to go and scan as many of these Kentucky USCT soldier pension files as we can. And also there's burial information. And this is one of the descendants of this particular soldier, Jim Sanders, who it turns out lived about 2 miles away from this cemetery his entire life and never knew that his second great-grandfather was buried there because he didn't know what name to look for. And if you look closely, it says James Dixon on his headstone. Okay, so widows also applied for pensions, and this gives us a whole nother batch of information, again, that we would otherwise not know. So this is a pension card for the widow of an formerly enslaved man named James Montgomery Greathouse. His wife was Betsy Greathouse, and we will see her here as an elderly woman with her great-grandsons, Muhammad Ali and his brother, whose name is escaping me. So this was taken in the early 1960s, right around the time that Muhammad Ali became heavyweight champ. So one of the things that I also learned is that quite a few of these widows' pension files are online. So there's about 500 Kentucky widows' pension files that are online. And so this is an example of one that I found where this Louisville born enslaved woman who eventually lives into I think she lives until 1920, if I recall correctly. So she went blind, and her son wrote on her behalf to her US Senator asking for her pension, her monthly pension, to be increased because she was blind and could no longer work. So this is an act of Congress that got her an increase in her monthly pension. And this is Solomon Guggenheim, part of the family that the Guggenheim Museum is named after. So there's a bunch of resources that are available to research these soldiers. So in addition to these ledger books we showed you and the military records, there's death registers, pension files, pension cards, the US Census, these slave schedules that I mentioned, which oftentimes we can, by knowing the age that the soldier was when they enlisted, we can go back and look in these slave schedules and see, oh, there's a male age 21 in the 1860 census, and we know the name of the enslaver, so we can try to pinpoint who that person was at the 1860 census. We already mentioned the various legal records, the church records. Also, we are looking in newspapers and church newsletters after the war to see if we can find information about these people. So we are currently in the first phase of this Kentucky Civil War Soldiers Project. We started it this past summer, and our goal for this first phase, which we'll be doing throughout the next year, is to research approximately 750 soldiers from 9 counties surrounding Louisville. We have a combination of student interns and volunteer genealogists, and actually we're soon to start paying some professional genealogists to work with us as well. And they're going to research each soldier and their family, compile documents, and create family trees for each of these soldiers and their families. All of this research will be put on our project website, reckoningradio.org. We are working with educators from the University of Kentucky to create free curricula for elementary, middle, and high school for Kentucky schools, actually for any schools anywhere, but specifically for Kentucky schools. We've already created a similar set of curricula attached to our radio series, again, also available on our website at reckoningradio.org. We are commissioning an African-American writer to turn all of this research into a set of biographical articles about some of these soldiers and their families, which will also be posted on our website. We're going to be working with, and actually have already started working with, an African-American advisory group that includes scholars, educators, genealogists, artists, and community activists to try to make sure this has the very best positive impact on the Black community locally and nationally. Because remember, maybe you don't know this, but Kentucky was the second largest exporter of enslaved people during slavery. So there are, I take that back, the fourth largest. So there were an enormous number of Kentucky-born slaves who ended up in virtually all the states of the South and into the West, as far west as Texas. And so after the war, these people, started to move all over the country. So there are people descended from Kentucky enslaved people all over the country. Ultimately, our goal is to research all of these 9,000 soldiers that we find in these ledger books, to publish all of the findings on our website. And we're going to archive all the research that we're doing on archive.org. So 50 years from now, it'll also be available. We're also taking all of the family trees we are generating and putting them on familysearch.org so that descendants of these people who have already started doing some genealogical research can easily find this information and hopefully learn about their enslaved ancestors. We're also going to provide the cumulative data that we are going to accumulate to scholars from various disciplines, especially African-American scholars. We think this will be of great interest, not just to historians, but also sociologists, economists, people who are in various African-American studies programs. It also occurred to us that this could be turned into powerful art, whether it's visual art or literature or plays. We have had conversations with Actors Theater. We are already working with the Unknown Project, which has put these limestone benches on the banks of the Ohio River that has a whole bunch of names of enslaved people. Some of those names were generated by this project. We've also been talking about a possible physical memorial to all of the 23,700 roughly formerly enslaved, or not necessarily all of them formerly enslaved, but African-American soldiers who served in the Union Army. Perhaps that too could end up on the banks of the Ohio River. If you would be interested in getting involved with this project in any way, so it's going to take an army of people, especially those with some genealogical background, to do this research. So we are very much looking for volunteers to do that work. Also, it's going to take an awful lot of funds to do this project. We anticipate it's going to take somewhere in the neighborhood of a decade to go through all of these records. So if you're at all interested in contacting us or making a donation, the information is on your screen. And that's what I have for now. And I guess I'll turn things back over to Patrick to see if we have any questions from the audience.
Well, thanks so much, Dan. And we do have one question in already, and I encourage anybody in the audience to use the chat and put those in if you do have any. We wondered about if you were able to elaborate on the process that led to the creation of these ledgers. What was that compensation process like for enslavers? And do we have a rough estimate of how many individuals sought compensation in this way?
So there's a library in St. Louis. The St. Louis Public Library got money to do a project where they went through all of the compensation files in Washington and put them all in a spreadsheet. And I looked at just the ones from Kentucky, and there are in excess of 1,000 claims that were put in by Kentucky enslavers. Now, in some cases, they had many enslaved people. There was one guy Trigg County, who, if I remember correctly, had 69 enslaved men that joined the army.
I bet that was Daniel Hillman.
That's right. That's exactly right. Daniel Hillman. And so he tried, I don't know if he succeeded, but he tried to get $300 per soldier. What I don't have at my fingertips is how many of them were successful, because, but there is a book that's been published by a gentleman that ironically has applied to work with us on this project as a researcher, a guy named, his last name is Haight, and he went through all of the Kentucky compensation claim paperwork and published a book that lists both the name of the enslaver, the name of the enslaved, who the attorney was. So we'll see Reuben Durrett handling many of these claims, not just, by the way, in Louisville. I found advertisements in newspapers across the state, in Owensboro, in Paducah, et cetera. So he had associates in law firms across the state that were affiliated with him doing this work. In that book, which I can find and put a link in the chat if somebody's interested, it lists all the people who actually got their $300.
It's really fascinating. Abby asked a really wonderful question about the enlistment process for these soldiers themselves. Do they volunteer? Are they conscripted? Are they offered for service by their enslavers? What do we know about the ways that these men came into the army?
So there seems to be at least 3 different ways that people, African Americans, join the army. So number one, they run away from their enslaver and join the army of their own volition at one of the various Union Army posts around. First it happened starting in 1863. I have found at least, I think, 2,500 people leave Kentucky and go to Ohio, Indiana, or Illinois in particular, and enlist there because, as I mentioned earlier, Kentucky was exempted from the call out to African Americans to join the Union Army specifically. Also the other border states, but Kentucky in particular, even after the other border states, Missouri, Maryland, et cetera, started to allow Blacks to enlist, Kentucky was exempted from that because Kentucky was considered such an important strategic linchpin for Union success. The big fear was that Kentucky would turn to the Confederacy and turn away from the Union, which they felt would be catastrophic because of Kentucky's strategic placement, both on the river and also for railroad connection to the south. So again, about 2,500 people leave the state and enlist during 1863 in the northern states. Then once enlistment is allowed within the state, you start to see people enlisting in one of 2 scenarios. Again, they run away from their enslaver and get to a enlistment spot, and not all of them make it, because this is during a time when it was a very lucrative thing for slave catchers to be roaming the streets of Kentucky looking for, and not to mention the entirety of the United States, looking for Black people who didn't have papers, right? And if they didn't have papers saying they belonged to so-and-so and they were on an errand to go get groceries or whatever, they could be arrested, put in a local jail, and then sold into slavery. So even though we're in the middle of the Civil War, even though the Emancipation Proclamation has been issued, Kentucky, slavery is still the law of the land. So if somebody leaves, let's say they're enslavers. So this is the story of the founder of Simmons College, Reverend Mars.
Elijah Mars.
That's right, Elijah Mars. So he's enslaved in Shelbyville. And he and about a dozen other men from his particular farm go walk from Shelbyville to Louisville to join the Union Army. And in his book, which is published after the Civil War, it's a wonderful book. You should take a look at it if you have the opportunity. It's available online on archive.org and elsewhere. They're having to walk through the woods, and they're constantly having to get away from the road because these groups of these slave patrols or slave catchers are out and they don't want to be caught and sent, either sent back to their enslaver or put in jail. So it was sometimes a very dangerous and arduous task to get from wherever they were enslaved to wherever they were enlisted. And in some cases, we're seeing the distance being quite vast because, especially for people who were in particularly sort of rural parts of the state, to get to the nearest city where there was one of these enlistment posts might require traveling, 100 miles on foot and staying off the roads through the woods. So think about what the level of, and remember, there's at least a secondary motivation here, and that is if they can get to an enlistment place, they will become free. And not only can they be free, but their wife could be free, their children could be free. So there's a huge motivator, right, to escape your enslaver and get to an enlistment place. So that's another scenario. Third scenario, which in the case of Archibald Dixon, the man that we talked about earlier, who was this enormous enslaver in Western Kentucky, Henderson, Union County area, they give their blessing. They are supporters of the Union. They're pro-slavery Union supporters, and they give their blessing for their enslaved men to leave and go join the army. And in some cases, the enslaver physically goes with them and accompanies them. So that was apparently the case with Archibald Dixon, because on all of the enlistment papers, he signs his name. So we have his signature in the corner of every single one of these enlistment papers. And by the way, these enlistment papers are at the back end of the military records, which are available online for all these soldiers. And in some cases, the clerk who filled out all the paperwork for the enslaved man who joins the army specifically says, joined without permission from owner, and then gives the name of the owner. So we have evidence of both them joining against the wishes of their owner, especially if their owner was a Confederate supporter, and a sizable minority of Kentuckians did support the Confederacy. And also it notes if they're doing it with the permission of their enslaver. So, and then the final group are those who are impressed into service. So they didn't enlist of their own volition for whatever reason, either because they couldn't, it was too dangerous to travel to, or they didn't want to leave their family behind, or there could be all sorts of scenarios where they don't want to do it. And so, and this is very interesting, as I understand it, and we know this from another memoir that was kept by another formerly enslaved Kentuckian. Actually, it shows up in two places. It shows up in Reverend Marr's book, and it shows up in a book by a guy named Peter Bruner, who was enslaved in one of the northern Kentucky counties, if I remember correctly. And they both describe the same thing. They were assigned as Black soldiers to go round up more Black soldiers. So these are regiments of Black soldiers who are going essentially door to door, farm to farm, and telling the white enslavers, we're taking your enslaved men who are of draft age, and they are being impressed into service. You have no, and they're armed, and you have no say in this. This is the law of the land, we're taking them. But this was something that happened later in the chronology of this. So first it was voluntary enlistments, then it was people being impressed into service. So this was essentially being drafted, except it was a different process than white people would go through. And then, by the way, there's one, as I think about it, there's a fifth alternative way that this happened, and it's fascinating. And that is, Black men from Kentucky end up serving, especially, I noticed this in Ohio, Southern Ohio. So these are soldiers from northern Kentucky counties along the Ohio River, are serving as surrogates for white people who can afford to pay their enslaver. So I want you to think about this for a second. It's a white man in Ohio, let's say, or for that matter, a white man in Kentucky, who is paying an enslaver for his enslaved man to join the army and serve as a substitute for that white man. So the Black man's not getting the money. The money is changing hands from enslaver to enslaver. I've seen evidence of this in Maysville, in the Mason County area. that soldiers were serving as substitutes across the river to people in Scioto County, I think it is, that's across the river. So at least 5 scenarios that I know of.
It's amazing, isn't it, how this really does track with that loss of support for the Union cause among white Kentuckians, and enlistments dry up, and nobody wants to get drafted as white men by and large, and so there is this willingness to even abandon slavery as long as it means not having to fight in 1864 and 65. It's really, really telling.
Yeah, I mean, I'm working on a separate project right now that's very much about the rage amongst a large swath of Northern citizens, white citizens, who by this point, late 1864, are completely fed up with the Civil War. They want it to end as quickly as possible, and they sure as shooting don't want their sons to go off and fight. They don't want to go off and fight. And so I'm in the middle of actually submitting a grant application to the National Endowment for the Humanities to do another season of the Reckoning radio series that is about this conspiracy that, by the way, Kentuckians were very much involved with, to essentially shut down the whole Northern war effort, negotiate peace with the South, and end the war. So more about that the next time we speak, perhaps. So yeah, it's a fascinating and I think important chapter in the history of the Civil War, and really the history of the United States, that has gotten little attention, was just how unpopular this war was, and how, by the way, I think the number is, of draft age African Americans in Kentucky, 47% of them were in the Union Army, okay? Now the comparison to white draft age men, if I remember correctly, is in the 20s in terms of percentile, okay? So a vastly larger percentage of Black people joined the Union Army during this period than white people.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a really excellent question from John about the usage of this data and how people can access it. You mentioned family search. Are there any plans to use platforms like ancestry.com or anywhere else to make this data as accessible to as many people as possible?
So I'm glad you asked that. So we originally planned to put this on Ancestry, and Ancestry, since we started this project, has changed their terms of service in a really kind of creepy way. This is my personal opinion, that basically says, we own everything you put up here and we can do anything with it we want, even if you don't want us to, and even if you explicitly keep it private, okay? So this has become really controversial, in particular in the Black genealogical community, because there's a lot of righteous paranoia about what kind of uses this genealogical information could possibly be put to in a negative way, in a way that could be damaging in the Black community. So, so far, the Black folks who are involved with our project, who are advising us, have said, maybe wait on Ancestry, because yes, it's a huge platform. Yes, a lot of Black genealogists use it, but essentially we would be putting all sorts of information about Black families up there without anything resembling their blessing. And the concern was that there could be, so we, at very least, we want to enter into this very carefully and confer with a lot of folks in the Black community about this. But at the moment, our current plan is that it would be on Family Search, which is free. That's the other thing. Ancestry, you have to pay at least, whatever, $99 a year unless it's on sale. So that can be an onerous amount of money for some Black families in particular to afford. So the thought was, let's put it someplace where it's free and accessible to all. And Family Search does that. And also we feel pretty comfortable with them as a partner with this. They're a nonprofit organization like we are. Again, it's also, all of this material will be archived on archive.org. And we're talking about putting the actual data, like our database of all this information, on one of a couple of scholarly websites that are created just for people to share data sets with scholars. So at the moment, that's our plan. But the majority of our hope is that people will be coming to our website, which we will be, publicizing the heck out of as soon as we start to make it live and make it available for the public. And by the way, our hope is that sometime no later than the spring of 2022, we will unveil our public-facing website with, at very least, all of the data from Jefferson County. So we have a couple of hundred soldiers from Jefferson County that we're researching. And so we're going to start by putting all of that data up, including some stories about specific African-American soldiers from Jefferson County. And there's some really interesting stories already that we found about several of these soldiers and their family members. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I was one of the things that's always really intrigued me about this project is the ways that it connects the Civil War to our own time and to the living memory of people and their grandparents still around today. I wonder if you could talk about the ways that this project can walk us forward in American history and also spread out, beyond the boundaries of Kentucky as we follow these families through the Great Migration into the early 20th century. It's really compelling.
Right. So let me tackle those two things separately. So first of all, the connecting to the present piece. So one of the great passions that I have as it relates specifically to the reckoning, this larger reckoning project, which is all about exploring the legacy of slavery in America. And we specifically say the legacy of slavery because everything that happens after slavery is all part of the legacy of slavery. The dehumanization that occurs during slavery continues after slavery. Indeed, slavery itself barely goes away. It just morphs into other things, right? It morphs into mass incarceration. It morphs into, debtors' prison. It morphs into sharecropping and, the sort of peonage system where people are perpetually in debt to their former enslavers. Something else that we talk about in the Reckoning series, which is to this day mind-boggling to me, is that the Kentucky Constitution until I think 1892 made it the law of the land that if you were a Black child and couldn't prove that you were working for a white family, you could be taken away from your family and put into apprenticeship with a white person, and that it was written into the state law that your former enslaver, that child's former enslaver, has first dibs to be the apprentice-master relationship, and that this continued until the 1890s. So think about that for a second. Okay, think about what that says about the kindergarten to prison pipeline we have today, and the fact that Black children are so much more apt to be suspended from school, expelled from school, end up being, corporal punishment, end up all these negative outcomes for Black students, that we can see the beginnings of this in the late 19th century as sanctioned state law, okay? So in my mind, that's how you connect the dots. You connect the dots quite literally by the institutions and laws that were created after the Civil War to perpetuate the same practices that happened under slavery. And it is not hard to continue to see, certainly through redlining and all the stuff that realtors did in the 20th century and to this day, just about, to make sure that Black folks and white folks are always living in different parts of town. And then all of the things that have been done by generations of politicians to make sure where the tax money goes. And up until very, very recently, and I mean literally in the past 2 years, in many cases, we still see this as business, what do you call it? Just as the way business is done in this country. So to my mind, that's one of the most important missions of this project, is to show how these things are easily connected from then to now. Now, to answer your question about how to expand beyond the geographic confines of Kentucky. So as I mentioned before, because Kentucky was a massive exporter of enslaved people during slavery, we have this large diaspora of Kentuckians who end up in particular in Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, Alabama. But then after the Civil War, Kentucky was one of the bloodiest places in the country in terms of racial violence. There's a wonderful / horrible book written by George C. Wright that I could highly recommend to anybody on this call, called Racial Violence in Kentucky, where he very clearly delineates all of these horrible examples of not just lynchings, but ethnic cleansings, basically racial cleansings, where entire towns were just, emptied of Black people, including some in the Kentuckiana area. And so then you see these people moving first within the state and then outside of the state, right? And it's my thesis is that it was not necessarily economic migration to get to better paying jobs, but first, at least, it was, I want to get the heck out of here. This is a dangerous place to try to raise my family. Parenthetically, Kentucky fought tooth and nail as long as humanly possible to keep from educating Black people, right? So there's a 50-year gap between the establishment of Central High School in Louisville and the Black high school Dunbar in Lexington. 50 years between them, okay, from the 1870s to the 1920s. So until the 1920s, if you lived any place other than Louisville and you wanted your kid to get beyond grade school, you had to leave the state, okay? And indeed, there's a family, there's a whole book written about a family from Hopkinsville, where it's the story of this man's family, basically their family maid, and that was her family story. They had to all leave and go to Indianapolis just so the kids could get an education. So we're going to be able to see all of this migration, okay? And through these census records that we're going to keep track of with all of these family trees, one of the things we're excited about is doing some sort of visualization on our website, with maps, so that you can literally see, here's where everybody is in 1860. Here's where everybody is in 1870. Here's where everybody is in 1880. That's for those who stayed in Louisville or stayed in Kentucky and were there at the end of the war. Never mind this larger diaspora that was separated from their families by slavery. One final thing. We're really, really, really interested and have been talking a lot about how can we build our database so it talks to other databases of other projects that are really interesting digital humanities projects that are being done around the country. For example, two in particular. One is there is a wonderful project called Freedom on the Move that University of Kentucky is one of the partners of, which is tracking fugitive slave ads in the decades before Emancipation. And so we want to connect with that and see if, for instance, all those soldiers who left Kentucky to go join the Union Army in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, do we find evidence of fugitive slave ads in Kentucky newspapers for those men? That's a thing we can look for, right? Similarly, there's another wonderful project out of Villanova University called lastseen.org, informationwanted.org. It's called the Last Seen Project. These are ads that people put, classified ads after the Civil War saying, I'm looking for my mother, my brother, my father. Last seen in Louisville in 1850, enslaved by so-and-so, then they were sold to so-and-so and they went to Louisiana. Do you know where they are? So one of the things we want to see is, can we visually see any of this happening? Can we see any of these families coming back together? Can we see evidence of broken families coming back together? Freedom on the Move. Someone's asking in chat, what's it called? freedomonthemove.org. And the other one is informationwanted.org. Another question?
We had a question circling back to the identification of graves, as you showed with the Dixon-Sanders confusion there. I'm wondering about the sources that might be used for that, including WPA records as they were going back and trying to locate these individuals. What sources are we using to help identify a grave site?
Right. So I'm not an authority on this, but I can say for military burial grounds, right? And I'm just thinking locally, one of the largest, unfortunately, is in Eastern Cemetery. And if any of you don't know this story, Eastern Cemetery was, and it occurs to me, possibly because there were so many African Americans buried in Eastern Cemetery, people were being buried in some cases, 4 or 5, down, meaning they were reburying bodies over and over again in the same grave. But there's a military cemetery there. There is a relatively small number of African Americans at Cave Hill. There are some Civil War soldiers, again, a small number in Greenwood, a small number at Louisville Cemetery. But certainly someone could go through all those headstones. Literally, you could stand there with a laptop or, an iPad or something, and you could just look these names up in this database of pension cards, okay, and just look to see, is this the same name that they were known by in freedom? Or is this the name, like Jim Dixon, that they're simply being buried under that name because that's the name the military has? And the military paid for the headstone in almost all cases. So they simply went with whatever name was in their records. So, this story that happened with this family in Indiana that was able to find their ancestors' headstone, I'm sure would play out all over the place, all over the country, where people were buried under one name and not the name that their family knows them as. But I'm not an expert on this, and I can't really speak to the logistics of how you would best go about doing it.
Got one last question here, sort of asking about the statewide coalition of organizations and institutions that could support this work, asking specifically about the Kentucky Historical Society, but I wondered if you could talk more broadly about sort of who all are you in contact with, because I know it's a lengthy list.
Right. So in brief, these are the folks that we've talked to so far. So in addition to the Filson, the Kentucky Historical Society, the African American Genealogical Group of Kentucky, who've been an absolutely key partner for this project, and several of their members are involved as either staff or volunteers. The following universities have been deeply involved with this project: University of Louisville, University of Kentucky, Northern Kentucky University, Western Kentucky University, Berea College, Simmons, Spalding. So we're working with scholars from all of those universities. In many cases, they have sent us student interns. Those are the main institutions that we've been working with. Closer to home, the Unknown Project, which is a project of this nonprofit group, Ideas Lab X. We've also talked to the Fraser Museum and the Roots 101 Museum that's just opened up down on the river. So those are the main institutions. And the Kentucky Center for African American Heritage. As a matter of fact, we're very interested in working with them, and we've had multiple meetings with them to possibly set up their space as a place where African Americans from Louisville can come to and do genealogical research using our database, and that they could have that set up on workstations in their facilities. So we've been talking to them as well.
Well, that wraps up the time we've got. Dan, personally, let me thank you for including me in both the Reckoning and in this project, and for letting the Filson participate in some of the projects that you've had going on. I feel like they're very important for the city and for the state, and using our past to build a more informed and better future. I'm really looking forward to helping this project move forward, and I can't wait to have you back shortly and share some updates with everybody.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, everybody have a great afternoon.